Thank you for joining us on the Going Deeper podcast, a ministry of Fathom Church in Littleton, Colorado. You will never get to the bottom of the depths that are in Christ for you. And our hope with this podcast is that it will help you go deeper with God. So let's dive into this episode of the Going Deeper podcast. What's up, everyone? This is your host, Kyle Knight, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast. Man, these are conversations that we hope to help you go deeper in your relationship with God. I'm in the podcast studio with our very own missions minister, Karina Bost. Hello, Karina.
Hello.
And our lead pastor, Chris Martin. Hello, Chris.
Hey.
Hey, so obviously you could tell by the name of this episode, this is a little bit more of maybe a sensitive topic. So we're going to say it just off the bat now. Obviously, if you're listening to this, maybe in the car with kids or something, you might not want to.
Yeah, maybe it's a PG-13.
Yeah, we'll put
a PG-13 rating on this one.
On this,
we're not going to get too crass.
Yeah, not too crass, but
there is a lady in the room, so we have to.
Yes,
it's not just a couple of dudes bulldogging
which
on
is
this
really
one.
good. Yeah. So that is kind of the warning right at the top here. But this episode, we're going to be talking about masturbation, and really, like, Chris, I want you to just briefly kind of tell us why we're talking about this. We have talked about, if you've been kind of following along with this podcast over the past year, we had an episode on sex, we had an episode on pornography. But now we're going to talk about masturbation. And so Pastor Chris, maybe why is this different from those, and really the importance on why we need to and should be talking about this on this podcast?
Right. Okay. So I don't remember exactly what we said on those other podcasts.
Who knows?
But
somebody does.
Let's refresh our minds on what the biblical sexual ethic is. Okay. Sex is God's idea. He came up with it. He created it. He could have, in any manner he desired to, create the ability for humanity to procreate. But instead, he decided to make it the way that it is. It feels the way that it feels. It is experienced the way that it is experienced, because that is in God's good and right creation. So we have to do a little bit of front end work to say sex isn't the problem. Okay. But then the biblical ethic of sex is that sex is for married people. It is for one man and one woman in a marriage, in a covenantal marriage. That union is the only appropriate place for sex. So that's, I mean, we're talking Orthodox Christian theology around sex. That's what that is. That sex is good. It is a good gift from God that is meant to be enjoyed for procreation and recreation within a marital union. So there's our definition of sex. I think that's what we said in the podcast.
That sounds about right. That sounds about right.
It's probably close to that.
Yeah.
Because it was us. Okay. Then the second question becomes pornography. And we talked about porn, and we talked about just what that does to an individual, what that individual is trying to accomplish by looking at porn, what porn does in terms of objecting women and even men as essentially objects of for your own use. It almost is a form of, it's almost a form of enslavement. You're treating somebody as property, as opposed for your own pleasure, as opposed to human dignity and value and worth. So pornography is kind of another layer. And our word pornography comes from the Greek word porneia, which is normally in the New Testament translated as sexual immorality. So porneia is, we always say it's like the junk drawer for any sex outside of marriage. So pornography would be in that category of porneia. Seeing a prostitute would be in porneia. Adultery would be a form of porneia. It's any sort of sexual misconduct outside of the biblically prescribed boundaries for sex. So that's what I think talked about a little bit in the pornography episode. The question that I get I primarily have conversations about these things with men in our church, which is good and right and appropriate. But I have lots of conversations with guys in our church. I've done that. In 20 years of ministry, from junior high boys to high school boys to college age guys to premarital guys to guys in their marriage to guys who are 40, 50, 60, 70 years old who are still struggling with sexual temptations across the board. One of the things that I hear is, Chris, I understand that porn is wrong. I understand that sex outside of marriage is wrong. But what about masturbating? Like, what about the act of self-release through orgasm? Is there ever a way to do that is not sinful? Or is it sinful? Can it be, well, I don't look at porn, but I only masturbate? Like, is that a valid thing for a Christian man or woman to partake in? And so that's why I want to have this conversation as on top of the other conversations that we've had maybe in the same genre. Because I do think some might say it's a technicality. Some might say it's a totally different thing. Some might argue that it's completely natural and it's actually just like going to the bathroom. Like, it's part of what a healthy individual does. So what does the Bible have to say? What does Christian wisdom have to say? What do we have to say? Because it really only matters what we say. So that's kind of the impetus behind this conversation.
Okay, good.
So it's awkward, right? But I think it's something that we should dive into to go deeper on this. Yeah. Okay. Why don't we start with the scripture?
It's a good place to start.
Yeah. I only know of one place explicitly dealing with this. Although now that I'm saying that, maybe Leviticus talks about this too. There is some stuff in Leviticus. What is it? 17? Leviticus 17 or 18 or 19.
And as I was like looking this up, I mean, there's a lot of places will say that there's no this. I think there's not that explicit verse again, like some other things that we've talked about even on this podcast, of there is that one go-to chapter, one go-to verse that talks about this specifically.
Right.
But I think when we talked about this right before we hit record, that there's a few instances where that this could be like kind of pointing.
Okay. I'll bring up this. I'll bring up the one that came to mind for me was Genesis 38. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay. And then Jacob has sons. Remember Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat and the other 11 sons. There are 12 sons of Israel, of Jacob. Well, one of the sons is named Judah, who turns out to be kind of a dumpster. But whatever.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. So there's this moment where Judah has taken a wife for his son, whose name is and the woman's name is Tamar. Judah, his, I guess, daughter-in-law is a woman named Tamar, who, by the way, is in the lineage of Jesus. So that's wild. But Tamar is married to Judah's firstborn son, is a wicked man in the sight of the Lord, and so the Lord puts him to death. Well, by custom, Judah would then take Tamar, wife, and marry him to the next eldest brother. Okay. So Tamar goes to his next son, Onan, and says, go into your brother's wife. So that's euphemism for sex. Okay. Have sex with Tamar and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Now, the reason why this practice was in place is because land allotment was handed down from the father to the son. And so if had no sons, his land would be forfeit. And so Onan is asked to perform his brotherly duty by providing an heir, not for Onan, but for So he would have sex with Tamar. Tamar would produce a male heir who would inherit land. That's the idea there. Verse 9. So Genesis 38:9. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. right? Because they would be officially Er's offspring, even though is dead now. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, into Tamar, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And verse 10, and what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and God put him to death also. So that's, I mean, wasting your semen on the ground is kind of the classic, I said before we started recording, the classic kind of like fundamentalist, don't, this is the verse that we point to in the Bible to tell, 13-year-old boys to stop playing with themselves because God will put you to death. Like almost like a fear tactic. Like, look what happened to Onan. It's the sin of Onan. You can read about it online. The sin of Onan is often equated with masturbation, even though this is not masturbation, like in a real technical sense. It's just not finishing. Gosh, this is really, really filthy to talk about. But it's in the Bible. And let's be real. Everybody is thinking about these kinds of things. Like this is a real practical struggle for, I would wager, most of the men and women in our church. Whether they have or still do struggle with this kind of stuff, the question is it a sin? Well, some would point to Genesis 38 as, yes, it is a sin. God sees it as wicked. I'm not sure. I think that God is saying that wasting your semen on the ground is what's wicked here. I think disobeying your father, not performing in this culture your brotherly duties in order to help preserve the land allotment. So there's a lot of history that goes into this and context that goes into this, but I don't feel comfortable saying, here's your tried and true, don't masturbate, verse. So that's Genesis 38. Do we have any others? Did you guys find any others as you were? I mean, I know Leviticus talks about bodily emissions and things like that, but that has more to do with cleanliness and not being clean than it does, I think, to do with masturbation explicitly.
Did you have any, Karina?
Not explicitly on masturbation, no.
Yeah, and I mean, I would agree too. I didn't really find any others, but I mean, we obviously have all the stuff that is very explicit with the sexual sin, like all that kind of stuff. And we've talked about our podcasts on sex and pornography, all that kind of stuff. That's all in there. But I don't think, to my knowledge, that there is any other verses that really talk about what we're talking about with masturbation. Karina, what are your just initial thoughts on this, on what Chris read, talking about this and being a sin? What are your first initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to like biblical backing up of this, Chris kind of mentioned, some people would say, well, I can masturbate without pornography, but I think, can you masturbate without lust? Because the Bible is full of verses that talk about like, you should not lust.
Yeah.
Like it just on repeat, like lust is not good. So I think that's kind of one biblical argument you could make is it comes from lust or out of lust or
that was one of my big questions was and I do think this might be, I don't hear this kind of justification for it with guys as much, but that is a question. Is it possible to masturbate without lust? Can you separate those two things? The act with the lustful, sinful desire of lust.
So let's what do you guys think? Let's try and define lust.
Yeah.
Okay.
How do we define lust?
You want to take a first swing at this?
No, I'm going to look it up in the dictionary.
No, come on now. We're
I mean, I would define lust as a desire without restraint. Okay. So kind of a desire now, and thinking of sexual desire, like I guess we're in that mode of that kind of sexual lust. Lusting after someone is, I think that that desire for that person that kind of snowballs into some kind of act or something like that, or some kind of those thoughts towards that person.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's desiring something you don't have. And we use it often in a sexual context, but lust itself can be.
You can have lust for power.
Or, money.
Bloodlust. Yeah.
Bloodlust.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. I think if we're going to funnel it down to really just talking about sexual lust, then I think it's like shooting from the hip here. I think that lust is wanting the benefits of sex outside of the biblical bounds for sex.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's.
I would agree.
I think it's close.
Yeah.
That's probably close to.
Mm-hmm.
It's wanting something that, I mean, you would say with lust, like in a more general sense, it's wanting something that's not yours, that's not for you. But in the sexual sense, it's wanting something, whether that's pleasure or whether that's, power, or whether that's fulfillment, or whether that's comfort, whatever it might be, and trying to get it in a place that is not supposed to be gotten for you in that way. That would be my thought on what lust is.
So then I think as we're talking about, okay, well, is masturbation a sin? Is it wrong? I think when you link that with lust, like if you're doing, and you talked a little bit, Chris, about reasons for doing this, like and we'll kind of get into that a little bit, but if the reason is lust, if the reason is, going towards pornography, all that, then we would say, like, yes, then that is wrong. That goes against God's plan for us and our lives, and his sexual ethic that he built around us as humans and marriage. So I think what we're kind of saying here is that lust piece, if that is part of it, then that's a sin.
Right. Yeah. So I think we can confidently say the Bible says you should not lust.
Yes.
I mean, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, somebody say, I have never committed adultery. And I say to you, if you have lust for a woman in your eyes, it is as if you have committed adultery in your heart. So Jesus levels lust up to the level of of adultery, of actually, having physical sex with another person. Lusting after them is the sin that's akin to that. So we could then say, yes, lust is a sin. Is masturbation a sin?
That's where I was going to get.
That is kind of the following question. Now, just like we said when we talked a couple weeks ago about Halloween, we don't want to add to the counsel of God, right? So we don't want to add to it, but we also want to apply biblical wisdom and biblical theology to our ethics, to our morals. So I don't know that I would be able to say with 100% accuracy that masturbation is always a sin. But I would say that it is most of the time, a sin because it is lustful, like it's accompanied with lust. Yeah. I can think of some situations where it may not be, but, and I say that gingerly. I just don't want to bind somebody to something that isn't actually biblical, like in the text. So that'd be my thought on it. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think also when you look at it as a sex act, and we know that the biblical prescription of sex is for marriage, within the marriage, like you said, for procreation and unification. I don't know that it fits within those criteria.
Right.
I mean, you're right. It doesn't explicitly say, there's nowhere that says hey, masturbation is a sin.
Right.
So you can't, I think you can just take pieces of scripture and what we know about it and kind of build our beliefs around that.
Okay, let's do this. Let's do this exercise. Let's take some categories. If you are an unmarried person, is masturbation a sin?
So I guess to me, I have so many things going on in my head right now about this, because if we're talking about, if you're throwing lust in there and like that's the reason for it, then yes, it would be a sin. But again, and I think we'll get to this, is like, I guess there are some other, I guess, reasons that people use masturbation for, that's not necessarily for lust, which is a little weird to think that you like separating those two, right? Even masturbation and lust. But I mean, I would say, yeah, if you're doing that for the lust piece of it, that sexual like self gratification, then yes, it would be.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
Karina, what do you think? Is it ever not sin for a single person, a non-married person, to masturbate?
I don't think so. And I mean, like Kyle said, we'll get to like other reasons. In my head, I just am struggling to like connect other reasons that are not like connected with lust in some form. But I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. The only thought I had was medical. Like that if there's a requirement for some sort of sample. I'm just thinking like, I'm just trying to think like, let's cover the gamut here. Like, there might be an isolated incident where it's like, okay. And then you need to still probably deal with wrestling through like, okay, how do I remain holy in this? Like, again, this is, it gets a little bit jumbled, which is why I don't want to say black or white.
Right.
Totally.
I didn't. Yeah, that's something I didn't even think
Like
of medical.
So there's a piece of that. Okay. I still don't think you should probably just like turn on porn. Like, can I have a magazine kind of thing?
Yeah.
Like, no, that's probably not the way to do that as a Christian. But I would say the act of orgasm, self-induced orgasm, which is what masturbation is, whether you're a man or a woman, is reserved for marriage. It's not a natural function. Although some will argue that nocturnal emissions and things like that are ways that, like just, like wet dreams, like things like that. Do those, like, does that
there's
count?
a lot of
I mean, there's a lot of things.
Yeah.
So again, I don't want to be over general here, but I think on a general, like the guys that I've counseled in this, that I've talked to are at some level looking for reasons why they are allowed to. They're looking for, they're trying to find the excuse or the escape clause, the little like, oh, okay, well that, of course lust, but like this isn't really lust.
Right.
Yeah. I'm not going to look at porn. I'm just going to, close my eyes. Well, and then I heard a guy say, listen, if you can masturbate without lusting, good on you. Like maybe you can, but he's like, I can't even imagine that. Right. Like when you think about like a loaf of bread, like there is a stimulus that is required for that kind of arousal.
Right.
So I think we can say pretty comfortably that on a very general basis, with maybe some room for a few exceptions, masturbation is not appropriate for unmarried Christian people. Can we say that with some confidence? And we've left a lot of room for like, the one guy who's going to send us an email and be like, what about this? Like, okay, like you might come up with a, what about this thing?
That's fine.
Okay. Here's the second question. What about married people? You never thought that we were going to dig this deep into this topic, did you?
No. I would still say it's probably still not okay, because then you're still turning to yourself for something. Like the sex act becomes very selfish. In the act of sex, it's about giving to your partner.
Right.
But in the act of masturbation, it's what you're doing for yourself, even if for however you want to present it, that it's not.
Yeah.
I feel like it still becomes really self-serving.
Yeah. You have to ask the question, what is sex for in a marriage?
Right.
What is it for?
Yeah. Yeah. And I would totally agree with Karina. it becomes more of this self-gratification thing sexually when you have a spouse, and that is what God designed it to be, together with your spouse. And so then that gets me thinking, well, if you're doing that, then, if you are married and you do masturbate, like, are you thinking of your spouse? And like, okay, is that okay to do? Obviously, if you're not thinking about your spouse and thinking of something else, then yeah, that is
right.
That is wrong. But yeah, I would agree with Karina that it's just, you've got something going on that you're taking that good thing that God has created away from your spouse, and you're doing that for yourself, and you're doing that away from that person. And it seems like that's not what it's designed for.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, there goes the music. Love it.
That probably did. Hey, we muted that now. We're still here.
We're still here. Hey, so I like it. I like that conversation. I think it's really important to remember what Karina just said, that sex, even within a marriage, is meant to be it's not a getting thing. It's a giving thing. Yeah. It's not meant to be, me getting my needs met.
Mm-hmm.
It's about me meeting her needs and her reciprocating and meeting my needs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it's supposed to be. And even Paul says in 1 Corinthians, like, hey, don't withhold this from one another. Like, don't use this as a weapon. Don't lead the other person into temptation by withholding this, those sorts of things. So there's the reason for sex in a marriage is for procreation, but it's also for the consummation, the unity of the marriage, right? It is a builder of intimacy. And that's why it is so, wrong outside of marriage and damaging when done extramaritally. Because you are like Paul says again, you are becoming one with a prostitute. You're joining with her in a way that you're not supposed to. Right. So I would say, I think, I've heard guys say this, well, we don't have sex enough in my marriage. And so, I masturbate, but that's better than me going out and cheating on her for that, which is just, like exactly what you want to hear from, a healthy, that's not a healthy marriage.
No.
That there's more work that needs to be done there. There's a lot more work that needs to be done there, but that's selfish in nature. Okay. Here's one I've heard, and I'd love for you guys' opinion on this. What about marriages where you have to be apart for a prolonged season, like military couples, things like that? What does that look like if there's an agreed upon arrangement or something? What do you, I mean, I'm just coming up with these scenarios that I know some people are thinking about or screaming at their radio about.
I mean, I think God asks us to practice self-control as well.
Those are the exact words I was about to. Self-control.
And coming from someone who's had a husband in military and gone for a long time, it's just a season that you have to know, like, you're committing to. I still can't imagine it. It doesn't change that, like, self-serving act of masturbation. I don't think that's one instance. I think it's just God could use that season to work on your self-control or, draw closer to. I don't know. There's other things that God could be doing in that season.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I have self-control written down here it's a fruit of the Spirit. It's an act of obedience to God. As you're reading that scripture, you're right. It's like he wasn't obedient to what God wanted him to do. And so, and self-control is just that's just screaming in my head of like, man, God has given us and wants us to be self-controlled with our, I think I have it written down somewhere. Where is this 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. It talks about that it's God's will that we be sanctified, should avoid sexual immorality, but also learn to control your own body in a way that is honorable. And so yeah, there's a lot of things, not just like the sexual sin piece of this, but like other sins where it's like you can kind of make that justification of, oh, well, I'm away from them as long, but like any kind of justification to get whatever that you want, that quick little self gratification, whatever it is. But we have to remember that, we have to remember self-control and self-control of our own bodies, and that God is going to honor that. And as we glorify him in our self-control with these things that he has given us, these amazing gifts that he has given us, showing self-control is honoring to him. Yeah. And so, and listen, I have not been there in the case of like having a spouse gone for like so long. So I know that kind of stuff happens, and I know it's very difficult, but so is a lot of other things that people struggle with, a lot of other addictions and that kind of stuff. And God has given us and wants us to be self-controlled of our own bodies.
Yeah. I think you guys are spot on this. And so I would say the same thing that I would say about it with unmarried people is that I think on a real general basis, it's unwise, if not sinful, to masturbate. Knowing what we know about the purpose of sex, that sex is meant to be in a marriage as a giving, not a taking, as a selfless, not a selfish act. You might be able to convince me of some sort of, random thing that yeah, I had to do it for. Okay, that's fine, but not just excuse making. But I think on a whole, it's probably not wise. And now let's do this before we wrap up. I think if this is something that you struggle with, if you struggle with self-gratification, pornography, lust, those sorts of things, I think the real important work to be done is to ask the question underneath the action. Like what's underneath it? Because it's almost never sex that at least to start. You start because you're curious. You start because you're lonely. You start because you're scared. You start because you're hungry. You start because you're worried. You start because you're anxious and you just need a release. You start whatever it might be. It's a coping mechanism. It's you're trying to control or trying to develop some sort of coping skill or mechanism. And then very quickly, those endorphins and all of the physical stuff that goes with an orgasm your body becomes dependent on that as your means of release, your means of coping with things. And the question underneath that of what is that pain that I'm trying to cover up? Like, what is that thing that I'm trying to deal with? Is the only way that I think you can find freedom from this. Because I've seen it. I've seen guys find freedom from not just porn, because you can filter and block your way out of most of those things, but lust, fear, some of those more root sorrow, sadness. I mean, some people masturbate because they're sad, right? It's the same reason why they drink, or it's the same reason why they do drugs, or they, eat pounds of candy. I don't know. Like they're trying to fill a hole in them. And the only way, and I promise you, victory can be found. Like freedom from these things can be found. Jesus has given you the power to overtake sin, to say no to sin. But you're gonna have to do some of that hard work of saying what's underneath this. Cause it's very rarely just like, I'm a sex addict. Sex addicts are sex addicts because of something else normally.
Yeah, that's a good place to stop. I know we kind of went a little bit over time, but that was a really good conversation. Thank you all for joining in on this conversation. It
Yeah, it's a good one. It's
That's
an
a good
awkward one. Yeah.
But yeah, for real, church, if you are struggling with any of this, please reach out to us, talk to somebody about it. But thank you, Chris, for that last little remark that there is hope. There's definitely hope, and God has given you that power to fight this. And so, hey, thank you too for this conversation. Thank you, church, for listening, and we'll see you next time.